Well, let us turn in our Bibles to Paul's letter to the Philippians and chapter 1. Paul's letter to the Philippians and chapter 1. Now, if you want to do some further reading on the book of Philippians on your own, if you would be interested in doing that, then this little book would be a great place to start. It's called Basics for Believers by Don Carson, published by IVP. And that is an excellent summary, an excellent introduction to Paul's letter to the Philippians. But the book begins with these words, quote, "I would like to buy about 3 quid's worth of gospel, please. Not too much, just enough to make me happy, but not so much that I get addicted. I don't want so much gospel that I learn to really hate covetousness and lust. I certainly don't want so much that I start to love my enemies, cherish self-denial, and contemplate missionary service in some alien culture. I want ecstasy, not repentance. I want transcendence, not transformation. I would like to be cherished by some nice, forgiving, broad-minded people, but I myself don't want to love those from different races. I would like enough gospel to make my family secure and my children well-behaved, but not so much that I find my ambitions redirected or my giving too greatly enlarged. I would like about 3 quid's worth of gospel, please." Now, as Mr. Carson goes on to say, none of us actually say that sort of thing. And yet deep down, those words may reflect an attitude which we can sometimes have towards the gospel. It's an attitude which wants some of the blessings or benefits of the gospel, but none of the challenges of the gospel. It's an attitude which wants our lives to be impacted by the gospel to some extent, but not so much that it actually challenges or changes our long-loved actions and attitudes. And it is that kind of attitude that Paul is challenging in Philippians chapter 1. And he does so by revealing how much the gospel has impacted his own life, both shaping his prayers, verses 1 to 11, as we saw last week, but also verses 12 to 26, shaping and moulding his priorities. And as we come to verses 12 to 26, we hear him explain what that impact of the gospel upon his priorities looks like in practice. And the first of those is in verses 12 to 14. And there we learn about making the gospel a priority in all our circumstances. Making the gospel a priority in all our circumstances. Now, if you were here last Sunday, then you may remember that one of the reasons why Paul thanks God for the Christians in Philippi is because verse 5 of their partnership as the partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. And as part of that partnership, the Philippian church has recently sent a man called Epaphroditus to Paul, and they've sent him with a financial gift and with news of how they are doing. And as part of that partnership, Paul now writes and tells the church in Philippi how he is doing. And having heard in the grapevine, that's not this grapevine, but the bigger grapevine, having heard in the grapevine that Paul had been arrested and was now in prison, the Christians in Philippi were no doubt eager, desperate to hear this latest news from Paul. And here is what he tells them, verse 12. Now I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. That, I suspect, is not the news that they or we would have expected to hear from Paul in prison. And we wouldn't have expected to hear it for two reasons. Firstly, as you read through the book of Acts, you cannot help but come to the conclusion that Paul was one of the greatest pioneer missionaries the Christian church has ever known. Considering he lived at a time when travelling was either by foot or by sailing boat, the ground that he covered was remarkable. Read his sermons and you will see his ability to bring the good news about Jesus Christ to people of different racial and religious backgrounds. The converts in Philippi were a perfect example of that. His ongoing pastoral care and concern for individuals who had been converted and for churches that had been planted was never ending. And so, taking all that into account, you would have thought that the last thing that would have done the cause of the Christian gospel any good was for this missionary par excellence to be arrested and locked up in prison. On hearing of his imprisonment, we might have despaired, and we might have said to ourselves, of all the people the Christian church could afford to lose, surely Paul was not one of them. What chance have we got of reaching the world for Christ when our greatest evangelist is locked up? And yet, says Paul in verse 12, you don't need to despair, because I want you to know that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. So much so, verse 13, the whole palace guard, which apparently amounted to quite a considerable number of people, the whole palace guards and loads of other people have heard that I am in chains due to my allegiance to Jesus Christ. People who have previously never heard about Jesus are now hearing about him because I'm in prison. And what is more, verse 14, because of my imprisonment, other Christians have been encouraged to speak the word of God more courageously and fearlessly. And so, believe it or not, says Paul, what has happened to me has actually led to the spread of the gospel, verse 12. That's one reason why we would probably have been surprised to hear Paul's news. The other reason is that although he is in prison, the gospel was clearly still a priority for Paul. And I'm sure that's a surprise to us, because if you and I had been arrested and locked up because of our Christian faith, I suspect our communications with Christian friends would mention all sorts of other things. All sorts of things other than the gospel. For example, we would start by saying, now I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has been extremely unfair and totally unjust. And in addition to the injustice of it all, I want you to know something about the conditions in here. The bed is uncomfortable. The food is rotten. The nights are freezing. The Wi-Fi signal is almost non-existent. And so our letter would continue. Probably without a single mention of the gospel. Because the gospel would not be a priority for us in those sort of circumstances. The question is, under what sort of circumstances would the gospel be a priority for us? Well, I suppose that on those occasions when we're doing something that is explicitly or intentionally evangelistic. For example, the gospel might, in those circumstances, be our priority. For example, if we come back from a week on beach mission, or if at the end of the CU's mission week, or if on a Friday afternoon after we've been at the drop-in cafe, and somebody asks us, how did it go? Then, of course, we're going to reply to their question in terms of the gospel, are we not? For example, we'll describe the people we made contact with. We'll explain about some of the gospel conversations we had, some of the literature we were able to give out, and so on. After all, the primary purpose of those events was the gospel, was it not? But what about the rest of the week? And not just the Friday afternoon? And what about the rest of the university term? And not just missions week? And what about the other weeks of the summer? When we were at home or perhaps on holiday somewhere else? Does it ever enter our minds that those occasions are also, and perhaps equally, filled with potential gospel opportunities? Or is it perhaps the case that there are little compartments dotted here and there throughout our lives where the gospel is important to us, while the rest of our lives are almost viewed as being gospel-free zones, where the purpose and priority could be any of 1,000,001 things? Anything other than the gospel. If that is the case, then we perhaps need to reconsider how we view the Christian life, and we perhaps need to reevaluate our priorities in life. And I say that because if you are a Christian, then there are no compartments in your life, for the simple reason that all of life is to be lived for the glory of God. And that includes having a concern for the gospel of God. Please note, that does not mean that we spend every moment of every day, of every week, of every month preaching on street corners or giving out evangelistic leaflets like we perhaps do on beach mission or worship missions week or on a Friday afternoon. It doesn't mean that. But although it doesn't mean that, we can nevertheless view our workplace and our classrooms and our sports teams and our friendships and even our homes as potential mission fields. If Paul saw his unjust imprisonment as an opportunity for the spread of the gospel, if he did that in prison, then surely there are not many, if any, areas of our lives that we should view as being gospel-free zones. And if we view the whole of life, as Paul did, as a potential mission field, then when the opportunity rises, we will perhaps be more willing and more prepared to share the good news about Jesus Christ in a way that is wise and sensitive and appropriate. And by viewing all of life in that way, we will learn to make the gospel a priority in all our circumstances. Secondly, verses 15 to the first half of verses 18, and there we see making the gospel a priority in all our responses. Making the gospel a priority in all our responses. Now, having told us in verse 14 that other Christians have been encouraged to witness as a result of his imprisonment, Paul then goes on to explain that this sudden increase in evangelism is not quite as simple or as straightforward as it might sound at first. And the reason it's not is because, verse 15, some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. In other words, some people are witnessing with motives which are far from pure, far from perfect. And who are these people? Well, the first thing to say is that these people are Christians. They are some of the brothers in the Lord who have just previously been mentioned in verse 14. And it is also true to say that they are Christians who are preaching Christ. There is no indication that their presentation of the gospel is seriously flawed in its content. And therefore, these are not the same people that he refers to in chapter 3, verse 2, those dogs, those men who do evil. It's not those people that he's referring to here. If it were, then his response in chapter 1, verse 18 would have been very different, and it would have been more like his response in chapter 3, verse 2, or perhaps more like his response in Galatians 1, verse 8. Instead, these are people who are preaching a thoroughly biblical gospel, but who are envious of Paul and of his position of influence within the first century church. They were perhaps critical of Paul as well, saw his imprisonment as a bad testimony. After all, why did he ever appeal to Caesar? If he hadn't done that, he would never have ended up in the clink. It's his own fault that he's got himself into this situation. He's bringing the gospel into disrepute, they probably said. They claimed to be superior to Paul in their presentation of the gospel. And mixed in with that was the element of envy and rivalry that Paul refers to in verse 14. They saw his imprisonment as an opportunity for them to seize more power and influence for themselves. That's why they're doing so much preaching themselves. It's a golden opportunity. Now, can you imagine being in prison for your Christian faith? And what you get from some of your fellow Christians is a critical and a competitive spirit. Can you imagine that? As if your circumstances in life weren't bad enough. The very people that you would think would be there to help you and encourage you and sympathize with you. You are brothers and sisters in Christ. And they're critical of you. They're envious of you. And they're doing what they can to get ahead of you. I suspect we would be hurt and offended, and we would want to justify ourselves in response to that situation. We would want to expose their wrong motives and express what we consider to be our justified feelings. And yet, did you notice how Paul responds, verse 18? But what does it matter? What does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of that, I rejoice. Now, please note, the spread of the gospel on this occasion did not justify their false motives. And the spread of the gospel does not mean that bad behaviour and wrong attitudes should necessarily be swept under the carpet in church life or in Christian work. But what verse 18 does demonstrate is that when confronted with false motives, when confronted with a poor attitude on the part of some fellow Christians, Paul makes the spread of the gospel a priority in deciding how he's going to respond to that situation. For Paul, the spread of the gospel was more important than an apology. For Paul, the spread of the gospel was more important than sympathy or the soothing of his hurt feelings. For Paul, the gospel was a priority in all his responses. And in that, he is a tremendous challenge to us, is he not? I say that because we all have feelings, as I'm sure Paul had. Please don't think he's a robot. We all have feelings, as Paul had. And when responding to a situation, it's very easy for our feelings to be in the driving seat and to become the number one priority. Very easy. And consequently, we respond in whatever way we think is going to make us feel better. That is why we so often insist on our rights as Christian people. For example, if we think an apology from a fellow Christian will make us feel better, then we will insist on an apology at all cost. If we think the clarifying of our pure motives and the exposing of others' false motives will make us look good and therefore feel good, then that is what we will proceed to do at all cost. So much of our responses to situations can often be determined by what will make us feel better. And yes, there may be times when such a response is justified. For example, it was Jesus who said, if your brother sins against you, go and show him his fault. Matthew 18, verse 15. And if you want to know when you apply that principle and when you apply Paul in Philippians 1, verse 18, then come along on Tuesday night, because that's one of the questions. And so, yes, there may be times when such a response is justified, and you ought to speak to your fellow believer and challenge him and get it sorted out. But what Paul's response to this situation in Philippians 1 demonstrates is that there may also be other times when it is better to take a step back, and rather than respond immediately on the basis of our feelings, it may be better to take a step back and objectively assess what kind of response is going to be best for the work of the gospel and for the spread of the gospel. If only we were able to do that more often as Christian people, then perhaps some of the strife and the division and the animosity that has characterized the history of the Christian church, and yes, the history of the Christian union over the years, perhaps some of that might have been avoided. Although none of us like to be hurt or offended, as I'm sure Paul didn't, there may be times when our response to such situations ought to be verse 18. The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of that, I will rejoice. That is making the gospel a priority in all our responses. Thirdly and finally, middle of verse 18 through to verse 26. And there we see making the gospel a priority in all our decisions. Making the gospel a priority in all our decisions. Now, having said in the first half of verse 18 that he's rejoicing over the spread of the gospel, Paul goes on to say in the second half of that verse that he will continue to rejoice. In other words, this rejoicing is not just a passing momentary thing for Paul, but rather it is a constant and continual feature of his life. And the reason, verse 19, is that he knows that through their prayers and the help given by the Spirit of Jesus Christ, what has happened to him will turn out for his deliverance. Now, because most modern translations have used the word deliverance at the close of verse 19, it is often assumed that Paul is talking about his future release from prison. And yes, From what he says in verses 25 and 26, it would appear that he is confident of one day being released from prison. But a better translation at the close of verse 19 would not be deliverance, but salvation, as indicated by the Authorized Version. There is actually the word that's usually translated as salvation. And the reason Paul is rejoicing in verse 19 is because he is confident of his future and final salvation. He's confident of his future and final vindication, not merely before a Roman court, but much more importantly, before God, the judge of all the earth. And the reason for taking that interpretation is twofold. Firstly, Paul's phrase at the close of verse 19, that it will turn out for his deliverance or salvation, that is a quotation of a phrase used by Job, the Old Testament man, Job, in chapter 13, verse 16 of his book, where Job was certainly looking forward to his future and final vindication, not just amongst his fellow men, but his future and final vindication before God. And secondly, it is a desire to be found faithful in the sight of God that Paul goes on to express in verse 20, where he says, I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage, so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. You see, what Paul is saying in verse 20 is that his ultimate concern in life, if you were in his situation, what would your ultimate concern have been? His ultimate concern in life was not his release from prison, but rather the honouring or the exaltation of Jesus Christ in all of his life. In all of his experience, whether that be in his life or in his death. For, to me, perhaps one of the best known verses in the whole of Philippians, verse 21, for to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. In other words, says Paul, life for me is ultimately all about Jesus Christ. Honouring him, verse 20. Serving him, verse 22. And the reason, says Paul, I can view death as a gain is because at the moment of my death, verse 23, I will actually go to be with Christ. And that is surely, says Paul, much better than anything I can possibly ever know in this life. Is that your view of life this morning? Is that your view of death this morning? If you were asked what life was ultimately all about, what would you say? For to me, to live is... How would you finish that sentence? What one word would you use to sum up what your life is ultimately all about? Would you say, for to me, to live is pleasure? Or would you say, for to me, to live is career? For to me, to live is money? For to me, to live is sport? For to me, to live is family? If you would finish that sentence with any of those words, then have you ever considered what a dreadful thing death is going to be for you. And I say that because you won't be able to take any of those things with you. Your death will be a final separation from that thing or those things that your life has entirely consisted of. Your death will be a final separation from that thing that you invested your entire life in. And what a dreadful experience that will be. Whereas if you can say with Paul, for to me, to live is Christ. Do you see your life as ultimately being about the honour and glory and exaltation of that one who left heaven and came into this world and went to a cross and died for your sins so that you might live for him and so that you might one day be with him? Do you see your life in its various aspects, your relationships in life, your career in life, your financial affairs in life, your hobbies and your sporting interests in life? Do you see it all as ultimately being for Christ, for his honour and for his glory? Then if so, you can also say with Paul, for to me to live is Christ, to die is gain. Did you hear that? To die is gain. It will be gain because the one that you have lived for is the one that you will then go to live with. That is the great comfort which those who know and love and trust in Jesus have as they make their way through life and as they approach their death. For me to live is Christ, but to die is actually gain. And yet, says Paul, although going to be with Christ would be far better, I am actually torn between the two. Yes, on the one hand, I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far, verse 23. But on the other hand, verse 22, if I am to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labour for me, in that the gospel will continue to spread and will increasingly be worked out in the lives of those who already believe it. And that is why he can say to the Philippians in verse 24, it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body. Convinced of this, verse 25, I know that I will remain and I will continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith. Now don't forget, having been imprisoned and having awaiting trial, Paul was very much at a crossroads in life. Humanly speaking, the trial could have gone either way. Life or death. And although the outcome of that trial was not down to him, the outcome of the trial wasn't ultimately in his hands, his words in these verses indicate that if the decision was down to him, then it would be a difficult one to make. I'm torn, says Paul, between the two. But ultimately, he would be prepared to pass on what for him would personally be so much better, i.e. going to be with Christ. He would be prepared to pass on that for the time being, for the sake of the continuing work of the gospel. And if Paul was prepared to put the gospel first in that greatest of all decisions, life or death, if he's prepared to put the gospel first in that sort of decision, then surely that is a challenge to us to make the gospel a priority in the sort of decisions that we have to make in life, is it not? As you know, we face decisions, face choices, and we have to make decisions all the time as we journey through life. And as I said last week, many of the choices we face in life are not simple, not straightforward. Many of the choices we face are not between a right and a wrong option. Many of the choices we face are between a good and a better option. And the question we need to ask ourselves this morning is this: where does the gospel come in our decision-making process? Where does the gospel fit into that? For example, we've seen how it fitted into Paul when it came to making that ultimate choice between life and death. But where would it fit in with us when we come to make decisions about our career? When it comes to making lifestyle choices, when it comes to choosing a lifelong marriage partner, when it comes to organising our finances and our wills, when it comes to deciding where we are going to live, when it comes to those sort of decisions in life, what factors influence our decision-making process? What factors determine our choice? Is our decision-making process identical to the world's, in that it is essentially about making as much money as possible, achieving the greatest success possible, and having as much fun as possible? Or is our decision-making process going to be different, in that we are prepared to take other things into account? One of those being the work and the spread and the progress of the gospel. When faced with decisions in life, and when making choices in life, will we stop to consider what would be for the good of the gospel? 3 ways in which we see the gospel impacting the life of the Apostle Paul. Firstly, making the gospel a priority in all our circumstances. Secondly, making the gospel a priority in all our responses. And thirdly, making the gospel a priority in all our decisions.